Okay. Um, the leading officials were called mansabdars, and these were essentially generals of this vast Mughal army, and they, along with the emperor Akbar, were the recipients of the tribute being basically drawn out of the villages, as I've explained. This surplus was pumped upwards, and it was the emperor and the Mansabdars who basically got the main bulk of it. And of course, they used a great deal of it to maintain the army. The army, incidentally, was more and more equipped with rifles and artillery. It's a misconception that only the Europeans had gunpowder and gunpowder weapons. No, the Chinese, the Japanese, the Indians, in the course of the 16th century, acquired these weapons. Perhaps they weren't as good as German weapons. The best weapons being manufactured were made in Germany, but nevertheless, you do have local armaments industry. We saw that in the case of the Ottomans, and it's true also of India as well. In any case, the Mansabdars there were about 500 or 600 of these characters. They were in charge of army units, and each was assigned a different province from which they drew their revenue. At the same time, some Mansabdars became the advisors of the emperor. Now, these Mansabdars, obviously, a lot of them, maybe a third, were Turks. Another third were Persian, because as a matter of fact, India and Persia, the Persian Empire, had very close relations. And military men from Persia would, as well as scholars, migrated into India. So you have Turks, you have Persians, but you also have Muslim and even Hindu military men who were Mansabdars. That is to say, left over from the Delhi Sultanate, there were military men who became loyal followers of Akbar. Furthermore, what is really notable is that Akbar had the cooperation of the Hindu elites. This is not certainly the Muslims dominate right until the British take over, but the Hindus did manage to have a kind of subordinate place, just like the Arabs within the Ottoman Empire. So the Hindus, in particular, the Hindus were important because they had contact with the tens of thousands of Hindu villages from which the surpluses were drawn. Now, on the basis of this elite, you have the formation of a very sophisticated Mughal culture, which is made up of Islamic, Persian, and Turkish elements. Islamic, Turkish, and Persian elements. Furthermore, there is free trade. Merchants come and go between Persia, the Ottoman Empire, and the Mughal Empire in India. Merchants, but also religious figures as well. I would say that the West, we've already seen this, the Mughals employed Italian architects because I didn't really get into this in great detail, but the Italian Renaissance was so extraordinary in terms of its architecture that even in Asia, people paid attention. They also, there was a significant importation of guns from Germany during this period. As I said, the Europeans were successful. And this, of course, explains their military superiority. The weapons were the best weapons being produced globally. Finally, over time, clocks and watches from the West, from Switzerland in particular, clocks and watches were imported into India as well. Now, this court, as I say, had a real taste for luxury. And as I said, the palaces and temples were absolutely extraordinary, based on Ottoman styles, Persian styles, and distinctively Indian styles. And these palaces and temples adjacent to them would be the most luxurious gardens and interior courtyards. And within the palaces, very costly textiles and carpets adorned the rooms and the people who inhabited these courts. In war, people were of course, they used spears and so on, but also rifles and cannons. And in particular, the armor and the cannon were artistically decorated. There was a great attention to artistic decoration. And I've already mentioned the fact that miniature painting based on Persian models was very important, but also the Mughal court poetry was the highest art practiced if you were a good poet, you could make your way at the court of the emperor. Likewise, handwriting, what is called calligraphy, was much admired. You just couldn't scrawl your signature. No, training in calligraphy was a highly important art in the Middle East as it was in China. I would say in terms of the court spoke Persian. The language of the court was Persian, because Persia was considered the most cultivated of the three great Ottoman Islamic state. Persia was considered the most luxurious, the most cultured. And so Persian became the court language. It was almost like Latin or French in early modern Europe. Persian had this reputation. And of course, the common people couldn't speak it, and that was part of its attraction. Now, in order to, you have these noblemen who have enormous amounts of money. You have the Sultan, the emperor, who has enormous amounts of money. And likewise, at the local level, you have the Muslim nobility or the Brahmins. Now, all these people drew surplus from the common people, and they had the money to buy these fine carpets, these fine textiles, etc. And so there was, in the period, it started in the Sultanate, but it continued under the Mughals. In the towns, which were dominated by the Muslims, there was a considerable amount of luxury manufacturing going on. Textiles, rugs, glassware, ceramics, all for the nobility, all for the upper classes. Very little came down to the common people. The common people were living in these autonomous villages, minimizing any expenditure in the market. They had no means to do so. It was what we'd call luxury expenditure. And the nearest thing I can think of in terms of Europe is France, prior to the French Revolution, where the nobility and the court had all of this money, and they shaped the whole structure of consumption. The towns in France mainly produced for this nobility. And likewise, there was a lot of dispersed manufacture outside the towns. Well, the same thing developed in India, the kind of luxury manufacturing. Now, the importance of this is that this textile manufacturing in particular became highly developed by the late 16th, 17th century. These are all basically Indian names: muslin, cotton, cashmere, all of these fabrics are originally created in India, and especially for the nobility. Now, the most important of these was cotton. Cotton growing is facilitated by the Indian climate, and cotton was worn by a very large number of people in India. Well, by the 17th century, this cotton textile had conquered the Asian market. All of Asia was dressing itself in Indian cottons. And then in the course of the 17th century, the same thing happened in Europe. Whereas up to this point, the Europeans wore basically wool or silk. If you were noble or rich, you wore silk. But also there was linen as well, I forgot. But in India, they produced this cotton, and by the 17th century, cotton from India, cotton textiles became a rage in India, in Europe. And so this became a very important part of the oceanic trade. Remember, I talked about the Portuguese establishing themselves in Asia. Well, more and more of the cargo were these Indian cottons. And the Indian cotton industry basically conquered the whole global market. Everybody was wearing this stuff. And the Europeans were left with a huge balance of trade problem, because they basically had scarcely anything that they could send to India to make up the difference. So India acquired a lot of gold. That was what was referred during this period. This question of the cotton is important because it does eventually lead the Europeans to create their own cotton industry toward the end of the 18th century. And this is based on factory production. Indian production was handmade cotton textiles. The Europeans, including the English, began to produce in factories cotton, which was just about as good as Indian cotton toward the end of the 18th century. And it had serious consequences on India. So looking at the overall situation, I would say that the nobility and the emperor maintained their position until the late 17th century, when things began to go bad. But the common people suffered in the course of the Mughal Empire, 16th, 17th, beginning of the 18th century. It's estimated the Indian population had reached about 150 million by the end of the 17th century. And the level of taxation from the beginning of the Mughal Empire until then, until the late 17th century, had increased by 2.5 times. In other words, people were paying 2.5 times more taxes than they were in the early period. And most of this was luxury, was used for luxury consumption or maintaining the army at the expense of the common people and to the benefit of this relatively small nobility. Now, in terms of the actual outcome of things, a very important in terms of what happens in India is the role of what I would call the secondary nobility. The primary nobility of the Mansabdars up here, 600 people who, as I say, control 60% of the surplus being produced in India. But the surplus is delivered to them by this secondary nobility, which are called zamindars. It's the Mansabdars, and then below there are the zamindars. And why are they important? Because they're the ones who actually are in contact with the self-sufficient villages, and they force the peasants and the artisans in the villages to pay tribute to the Mughal state. This is the basis of everything. This is how the money accrues to maintain the establishment. And we meet some familiar figures. At the base, as part of the Zamindar elite, are the Brahmins, who, remember, consolidated themselves back during the Dark Age between 680 and 1200 BC. Prior to the Muslim arrival, the Brahmins, along with the Rajputs, are the elites, the consolidated into the elites. They control the temples, they control the local offices, and they extract tribute from the common people. There might also, later on, there were, of course, this is Hindu, Muslim elites, including rich peasants, who became zamindars itself. They were secondary state officials whose responsibility, as far as the state was concerned, was to deliver the tribute to the mansabdars. Well, in terms of what was developing in Indian society, we can say that Indian society suffered from two things right away: overexploitation, excessive taxation, and secondly, the fact that in the villages, there was no market economy, there was no development, because basically in the villages were self-sufficient. There were no merchants, there was little or no money, and so from an economic point of view, there was no development in Indian society. But nevertheless, the tribute was demanded. And this, as I say, the zamindars ordinarily gave it to the mansabdars. But what happens if the zamindars say, no, we're not going to give you the tribute. We're going to keep it to ourselves. And in fact, maybe we can get the support of the villagers to resist the oppression, the fiscal and political oppression from the emperor and from the mansabdars. Now, this begins to happen in the 17th century. You do begin to see that the zamindars begin to drag their feet. And indeed, certain dissident movements begin to develop in the countryside. The peasants and the artisans are so oppressed that dissident religious movements begin to develop against the Mughal elite. And it is eventually, this starts amongst the peasantry and the craftsmen, but the zamindars, rather than obeying their masters at the top, they begin to identify with the common people, take the leadership. And this becomes the most serious problem of the Mughal Empire and ultimately leads to its collapse, which we'll see next time.